My name is Marcus Webb, and I've spent the last 8 years documenting systems that operate beneath institutional awareness. This story concerns what happens when a person becomes, unknowingly, a conduit for transmission, not of disease or information, but of consequence. The title you are hearing is literal. It describes a mechanism. What follows is the documented account of someone who encountered it. In October of 2019, a man named David Chen, then 42 years old, accepted a position as a logistics coordinator at a mid-tier pharmaceutical distribution center in the outskirts of Toronto. The facility processed medications, supplements, and clinical trial materials for regional hospitals and clinics. David had worked in similar environments for nearly 2 decades. He was competent, unmarried, lived alone, and had no particular reason to refuse work that paid $38,000 annually with standard benefits. The job listing mentioned one unusual requirement. All new hires in his department would complete a 3-day orientation that included chain of custody documentation standards and what the listing called institutional continuity protocols. David assumed this was boilerplate compliance training. It wasn't. The facility itself occupied a converted warehouse on Dundas Industrial Park. 5 stories, built in the 1960s. The logistics operation occupied the 2nd and 3rd floors. The building had been modified multiple times over the decades. Walls added, systems replaced, but the core structure remained. David began his work on a Tuesday. His supervisor, a woman named Patricia, was professional and efficient. She showed him the receiving dock, the sorting systems, the inventory management software. Nothing unusual. The warehouse hummed with the ordinary noise of industrial logistics, hydraulic lifts, rolling carts, scanning equipment beeping in consistent intervals. Patricia mentioned, almost in passing during the first morning, that the facility had a very low turnover rate. When David asked what she meant, she clarified, people who worked here tended to stay. She said it as though this were a positive thing. The orientation began the following Monday in a small conference room on the 4th floor. There were 7 new hires, including David. A man named Robert, who introduced himself as Director of Institutional Operations, led the first session. Robert was approximately 60, with the careful speech patterns of someone trained in regulatory environments. He distributed binders. Each binder contained standard documentation, OSHA compliance, pharmaceutical handling protocols, confidentiality agreements. But embedded within the standard materials were pages marked operational continuity critical for all personnel. These pages described something Robert called the unit structure. According to the documentation, the facility operated on what was termed a responsibility accumulation model. Each person in a given department, in David's case, the logistics coordination unit, carried responsibility not only for their current tasks, but for what Robert called inherited procedural liability. This meant that if a mistake occurred in the department, whether you had personally committed it or not, you bore partial responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Robert clarified institutional responsibility. The binder explained that this structure ensured accountability and prevented the formation of departmental silos where individuals could hide incompetence behind bureaucratic walls. David found this language strange, but not alarming. He worked in logistics. Accountability was fundamental to the field. What Robert explained next, however, introduced the actual mechanism. Each member of the logistics unit was assigned what he called a predecessor relationship. When you joined, you inherited the file of whoever had left the position most recently. This file contained all their active cases, their error logs, their procedural notes, and this was emphasized, their institutional standing score. This score, calculated over the employee's tenure, reflected how well they had managed both their own responsibilities and the inherited responsibilities from their predecessors. When you left the position, your file, including your score, would pass to whoever replaced you. The system was designed to create what Robert called continuity of accountability. A mistake made 3 years prior could theoretically still be active in the system if it hadn't been fully resolved, and you, the new person, would inherit partial responsibility for monitoring and eventually resolving it. David asked, during the Q&A portion, how someone could be held responsible for mistakes they didn't make. Robert's response was measured. He said that the system wasn't punitive. It was structural. The responsibility wasn't legal. No external body would judge you for it. But within the institution you're standing, your eligibility for raises, your performance evaluations, all were connected to how well you managed both your current work and your inherited work. It incentivized people to understand the department's complete history. It prevented people from treating their job as a discrete, isolated role. They were, Robert explained, part of a unit. That unit carried forward what it received. During the second day of orientation, Patricia handed David his predecessor's file. His predecessor's name had been Marcus Wills. Marcus had worked in the logistics unit for 11 years. He had left, according to the hire date in the file, in early September, approximately 5 weeks before David started. It contained approximately 80 active cases situations, mostly related to medication batches that were flagged as pending resolution. Most were mundane. A shipment to a clinic in Mississauga had arrived with 3 units missing from the documented manifest. Documentation discrepancies with a trial pharmaceutical that had been mislabeled. A receiving record that had been filed without a corresponding authorization signature. Small institutional wounds that had never quite healed. The file also contained Marcus Wills's institutional standing score, 43 out of 100. David asked Patricia about this score. She said Marcus had been a good person and a capable worker, but he had struggled with what she called case closure. He would complete his immediate tasks competently, but he was reluctant to pursue resolution for inherited cases. He felt, according to Patricia, that he was being asked to clean up other people's work. His score had reflected this reluctance. She assured David that Marcus's low score was not a reflection of malice or incompetence. It was simply a structural reality of the system. The unit carried forward what it received. If you didn't carry it forward, your score reflected that. Over the following months, David settled into the work. He was, by temperament, detail-oriented. He found the logistics operations reasonably engaging, but he also made a deliberate decision. He would attempt to resolve Marcus Wills's inherited cases, not because he felt obligated by the system. He didn't, not initially. He felt curious about them. Why had Marcus avoided them? Most of the cases seemed straightforward enough. The missing 3 units from Mississauga, for example. David pulled the original shipping documentation, contacted the clinic, discovered the units had actually been delivered but incorrectly logged at the receiving end. The documentation discrepancy for the trial pharmaceutical. He found the authorization signature in a related email thread and had it filed retroactively. One by one, over several months, he resolved Marcus's open cases. His standing score, over that same period, climbed. By March of his first year, it had reached 72 out of 100. Patricia noticed and complimented him. She mentioned that his score was exceptional for someone in their first year. Robert, during a departmental meeting, cited David's work as an example of someone who understood the unit structure. David felt, genuinely, that he had accomplished something. He had inherited a burden and addressed it. The system had incentivized him to do so, and it had worked. But something else had also begun to happen. As David worked through Marcus Wills's cases, he noticed patterns in the documentation. Many of the cases weren't just administrative oversights. Some seemed to reflect more systemic problems with how the facility tracked certain categories of medication. Trial pharmaceuticals, in particular, seemed to have higher discrepancy rates. This wasn't Marcus's fault. This appeared to be a decades-long pattern. When David examined the files more carefully, cross-referencing with predecessor files that Patricia had provided him for historical context, he found that the trial pharmaceutical tracking issues went back at least 15 years, possibly longer. David brought this pattern to Patricia's attention. He suggested that the logistics unit might benefit from a systematic audit of trial pharmaceutical documentation. Patricia listened carefully. Then she said something that David found striking. She said that the unit carried forward what it received. Sometimes what was received was a problem too large for a single person to solve. Sometimes what was received was structural. The question wasn't whether you could identify it. The question was whether you would choose to inscribe it in your own standing score by formally reporting it upward. This was, David would later understand, the moment the system revealed its deeper logic. The standing score system wasn't simply about accountability, it was about choice. You could resolve cases and improve your score, but you could also discover systemic problems, and if you formally reported them, you would inherit responsibility for advocating for their resolution. It might, in fact, stall because you would now be spending time and political capital on an issue that wasn't formally part of your job description. The unit carried forward what it received, but you could choose what level of transmission to accept. David made what he thought was a practical decision. He continued to resolve the smaller cases in Marcus Wills's file, maintaining his score, but he didn't formally report the trial pharmaceutical tracking pattern. Instead, he mentioned it informally to Robert during a casual conversation. Robert thanked him for his diligence. He said that the facility was aware of historical discrepancies in trial pharmaceutical documentation, and there were ongoing conversations with corporate about implementing better systems. In the meantime, David should continue focusing on his current responsibilities. His score was exceptional. There was no need to complicate things. By the end of David's second year, his standing score had reached 88 out of 100. He had become, in the language of the facility, a high-standing unit member. This came with certain benefits. He received a raise. He was offered a supervisory track. Patricia mentioned, in a performance review, that she was confident David would eventually move into management. He was the kind of person the facility needed, someone who understood the system and worked within it. It was also around this time that David received the notification that he would have a predecessor file transferred to him. His original predecessor's file, Marcus Wills's cases, had been archived as expected after a certain period of time, but now he would inherit the file of someone else, the person who had held his position before Marcus. The file transfer was handled in a formal ceremony. Actually, Robert attended. It was presented as an honor. The older predecessor file contained cases that went back over 2 decades. Many of them had never been resolved. David understood immediately what this meant. The system wasn't closing, it was deepening. The longer you stayed in your position, the further back the inherited responsibility extended. David requested a meeting with Robert. He asked directly whether the system was actually designed to allow people to ever fully resolve their responsibilities. Robert's response was honest. He said that the question itself misunderstood the structure. The unit didn't exist to achieve resolution. The unit existed to maintain continuity. Cases were resolved or archived when appropriate, but the responsibility remained. When you inherited the file of your predecessor's predecessor, you weren't being asked to resolve their cases. You were being asked to monitor them, to ensure nothing had been overlooked, to carry forward the institutional knowledge that someone, at some point, had engaged with those situations. You were the keeper of that engagement. David asked what happened to people who left the facility without resolving their cases or achieving a high-standing score. Robert said that people left for various reasons. Some found work elsewhere, some retired. The facility didn't retain people against their will, but those who stayed, those who understood the structure, they rose. They became valuable. The facility needed people who could carry weight, who could understand that responsibility wasn't something you discharged, it was something you carried. For the unit to function, the unit needed people who had accepted that. Over the next 2 years, David remained at the facility. He didn't formally pursue the supervisory track, but he also didn't leave. His standing score fluctuated between 85 and 90. He became increasingly skilled at managing the inherited files. He also became, gradually, aware of something he hadn't initially noticed. The other logistics coordinators, those who had been there longer than him, or those who had been hired around the same time but in different departmental units, they seemed to share a particular demeanor. They were competent. They were reliable. They rarely spoke about their work outside the facility. They had, in almost all cases, been at the facility for at least 8 to 10 years. Nobody was new, really, except David. Everyone else had been there long enough that their predecessor files extended back many years. Everyone was, in effect, carrying the complete weight of their position's history. David was interviewed for this documentary in the spring of 2024, nearly 5 years after he had started at the facility. He described his experience with careful precision. He explained the structure, the scoring system, the gradual recognition of what he called the gift and the trap. The gift was meaning. You were part of something larger than yourself. Your work mattered not just for what you accomplished today, but for how you maintained the continuity of what had been accomplished before. The trap was indistinguishability. You could no longer distinguish between the responsibility you had chosen and the responsibility that had been assigned to you. The system had become so integrated into how you understood your role that you couldn't imagine working outside it. But what troubled David most, as he reflected on his tenure, was something more subtle. He said that he had begun to suspect that the facility, and perhaps the larger corporation, had designed the system not as a bug, but as a feature. Not to create accountability, but to create people who could never leave. Because to leave meant to break the chain of transmission, to walk away from inherited responsibility, to refuse. In effect, to carry forward what you had received. And once you had accepted that you were a unit member, once you had spent years carrying weight, the idea of not carrying weight anymore seemed like a kind of betrayal. Not betrayal of others, betrayal of the structure itself, which had given your work meaning. I asked David directly whether he intended to stay at the facility. He said he didn't know. He said that he had offers from other employers. He was competent enough to work anywhere, but he recognized with a kind of resigned clarity that leaving would feel wrong. Not legally wrong, not morally wrong in any absolute sense, but wrong within the logic of the system he had accepted. He had inherited Marcus Wills's cases. He had resolved most of them. He had inherited deeper cases from the predecessor's predecessor, and he had worked to maintain them. He had become valuable to the unit. To leave would mean someone else would inherit his work, his standing score, his institutional knowledge. They would have to rebuild what he had built, and he, David, would carry the knowledge of that abandonment with him for the rest of his career, no matter where he worked. I attempted to contact the facility's corporate headquarters to ask about the institutional standing score system and whether it was intentionally designed to reduce employee mobility. I was directed to a compliance officer who said that the system was a localized operational structure implemented at that particular facility and had not been formally adopted across the organization. The compliance officer stated that the system was voluntary, that employees were free to leave, and that the standing score was merely reflective of how well an employee understood their departmental responsibilities. When I asked whether the system might create perverse incentives that discourage departure, the compliance officer said that they would look into the structural implications. That conversation occurred in July of 2024. As of today, I have received no follow-up communication. The psychological structure at work here is not unique to that facility. It operates in various forms, across institutional environments where responsibility is fragmented and historical. It appears in academia, where junior researchers inherit the unfinished projects of their predecessors. It appears in government agencies where case files accumulate across administrations. It appears in any system where continuity is valued and departure is treated as abandonment of that continuity. The fear mechanism isn't supernatural. It is structural. It is the fear of being the person who breaks the chain. It is the fear that meaning can be constructed in such a way that you become inseparable from it. David Chen remains employed at the Toronto facility. His current standing score is 92 out of 100. He has declined the supervisory track position multiple times. He is, in essence, optimized. The unit carries forward what it receives, and David, having internalized this logic, carries it forward too. He is not trapped in any legal sense, but he has become, through a system of small choices and accumulated weight, inseparable from the structure that created him. That structure will continue. New people will join. They will inherit David's cases. They will face the choice he faced, resolve and stay, or refuse and leave. The facility doesn't need to coerce anyone. The structure coerces itself, and that is perhaps the most precise engineering of institutional persistence there is.